Hello everyone, this is Lynn from We See You Media. On July 4th, 1776, 56 men placed their names on a document that would forever alter the course of history, the Declaration of Independence. It wasn't just ink on parchment, it was an act of courage, a bold statement to the world that freedom is worth any price, even the price of blood. But what led to this radical declaration? And what does it mean for our freedoms today, especially the right to speak, worship, and assemble freely? Let's take a journey back in time to the birth of American independence. The road to that moment was long and filled with frustration. For years, the American colonies had lived under the heavy hand of King George III and the British Parliament. Colonists were taxed without representation, their legislatures were dissolved, and their petitions for relief were ignored. Worse still, free expression was often suppressed. Newspapers critical of the crown were censored, assemblies were restricted. Even gatherings that questioned royal authority were seen as dangerous acts of rebellion. But the human spirit has a way of rising against oppression. Voices like Patrick Henry's thundered in colonial assemblies, "Give me liberty or give me death." Pamphlets like Thomas Paine's Common Sense lit fires in the hearts of ordinary men and women, making the case that freedom was not just a dream, it was a duty. By 1775, the colonies had formed a Continental Congress to coordinate their response, but even then, many delegates hesitated. Breaking from the most powerful empire in the world was not a decision to be made lightly. By June of 1776, the tide had turned. The war had already begun in Lexington and Concord. Blood had been spilled. The choice was no longer between peace and conflict. It was between submission and freedom. The Continental Congress appointed a committee to draft a formal Declaration of Independence. At its head was a young Virginian named Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson was a gifted writer, steeped in the ideas of natural rights, life, liberty, and property, championed by philosophers like John Locke. But Jefferson also drew deeply from the Bible and from the conviction that liberty was not a gift from kings or parliaments, but from God himself. Over the course of just 17 days, Jefferson crafted a document that was both simple and profound, spelling out the colony's grievances against King George, while boldly proclaiming that all men are created equal and that governments derive their power from the consent of the governed. The words still ring out today. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those were not just words of rebellion, they were words of revolution, the declaration that human dignity comes from God, not from rulers. Of course, Jefferson's draft did not pass without debate. John Adams and Benjamin Franklin made edits. The Congress cut whole sections, including a passage condemning slavery. The final version was shorter, but still carried the radical force of Jefferson's opening lines. When the Declaration was adopted on July 4th, it was more than a break with Britain. It was a birth certificate for a new nation. Signing the document was no mere formality. Each man who placed his signature on the Declaration was committing treason against the British Crown. If captured, they faced the hangman's noose. John Hancock, President of the Congress, signed his name in large, bold script, declaring, "There, now King George can read it without his spectacles." Benjamin Franklin is remembered for his grim humor at that moment. "We must all hang together, or most assuredly, we shall all hang separately." The signers came from many walks of life. Some were wealthy merchants and lawyers. Others were farmers, doctors, and ministers. But they shared a common conviction that liberty was worth the risk. They pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor to the cause of independence, and many of them did pay dearly, losing homes, livelihoods, and in some cases, even family members. But what they gained, what they gave to future generations, was beyond price. The Declaration of Independence was not just about breaking away from Britain. It was about establishing a new principle, that government exists to protect God-given rights, not to grant them. That principle would later be written into the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, especially the First Amendment, which guarantees freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, the right to assemble, and the right to petition government for redress of grievances. Think about that connection for a moment. The colonists lived under a king who censored newspapers, punished dissenters, and treated gatherings of free men as dangerous. They fought a war to end that tyranny, and out of that struggle came the conviction that no government should ever again have the power to silence its people. The Declaration was the seed. The First Amendment was the fruit. Today, those freedoms are still under threat. From attempts to censor voices online, to laws that criminalize unpopular opinions, to pressures that silence people of faith. The spirit of King George seems to creep back in new disguises. But the lesson of 1776 is clear. Freedom must be defended in every generation, or it will be lost. The men who signed the Declaration were not perfect, but they were courageous. They understood that liberty would never survive if ordinary people did not stand for it. That truth is as urgent now as it was then. We may not face the hangman's noose, but we face the slow suffocation of freedoms if we stay silent. So the next time you hear those words, we hold these truths to be self-evident. Remember the price that was paid to write them. Remember that the Declaration of Independence was more than a document. It was a line drawn in history, a line that said, freedom is worth everything. And then ask yourself, will we defend those freedoms as fiercely as they did? This is Lynn from WECU Media. Thank you for joining me as we remember the courage of 1776 and the eternal call to guard the rights and liberties they fought to secure.